hands! Let me see your hands!
I'm a federal agent. 18.
Get on the ground!
Easy. Check my badge.
Do it now! On the ground!
Don't move, man. Turn around.
I'm not.
Taser!
Ah!
Get down! Roll him!
I got his arm.
Cuffs!
I'm a federal agent. Belt.
Badge right here. Hold
got
up.
him secure.
There is a particular kind of arrogance that comes with wearing a badge. It is the confidence of someone who has been given authority over others, the certainty that comes from years of being obeyed without question. But what happens when that arrogance meets someone with an even bigger badge? What happens when a local deputy, so sure of his own power, encounters a federal agent operating at a level he cannot even comprehend? The stories you are about to hear will answer those questions in the most dramatic way possible. These are real encounters captured on body cameras and patrol car recordings, where local law enforcement officers made catastrophic assumptions about the people they stopped. In each case, the officers were absolutely certain they had caught a criminal. In each case, they were absolutely wrong. And in each case, their mistakes led to humiliation, lawsuits, and serious questions about how police treat anyone who does not immediately bow to their authority. If you appreciate detailed breakdowns of real events that expose the truth about power and authority in America, consider staying until the end of this video. These stories deserve to be heard in full, and the conclusions we reach together might change how you see every traffic stop, every police encounter, and every person who claims to carry a badge. Let us begin with a dusty road in Nevada, where a simple traffic stop was about to become a masterclass in how not to conduct a law enforcement investigation. The afternoon sun hung low over the desert landscape of Silver Springs, Nevada, casting long shadows across Highway 95 as vehicles made their way through this quiet corner of Washoe County. It was May 15th, 2022, a Friday, and Deputy Marcus Reyes of the Washoe County Sheriff's Office was running radar near mile marker 47. The spring heat shimmered off the asphalt, creating that familiar wavy distortion that made distant vehicles seem to dance before they came into focus. Deputy Reyes had been with the department for almost 7 years. He was thorough, methodical, and proud of his attention to detail. On this particular afternoon, he noticed a dark gray Chevrolet Tahoe approaching from the south, and something about the rear license plate caught his eye. The registration sticker appeared to be partially obscured, possibly by a frame that wrapped too closely around the plate's edges. It was a minor violation, the kind of thing that could warrant a quick stop and a verbal warning. He pulled onto the highway and activated his lights. What Deputy Reyes did not know was that the driver of that Tahoe was not an ordinary citizen. His name was Viktor Petrov, and he was simultaneously serving as a special agent with the United States Secret Service, a task force officer with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and had special deputy status with the United States Marshal Service. At that very moment, Petrov was working deep undercover on one of the most sensitive investigations the federal government conducts, a multi-state child trafficking operation. His cover identity was that of a private security contractor, and everything about his vehicle, his appearance, and his documentation was designed to support that cover while still allowing verification if necessary. The Tahoe continued driving for approximately a quarter mile after Deputy Reyes activated his lights. In the vehicle, Petrov was processing his options. Going undercover means existing in a constant state of calculated paranoia. Every interaction is a potential threat to the investigation. Every person could be connected to the targets. Every unexpected stop could compromise months of careful work. Petrov knew he needed to stop, but he also needed to find a location that would minimize the chances of being seen by the wrong people. When the Tahoe finally pulled onto the shoulder, Deputy Reyes approached with the particular energy of a man who had already decided this was going to be a difficult encounter. The delay in stopping had annoyed him. In his experience, people who did not pull over immediately usually had something to hide. Viktor Petrov rolled down his window and offered a calm greeting. His face was weathered, the kind of face that suggested years of outdoor work and high-stress situations. He was wearing a simple gray polo shirt, nothing that would indicate his true profession. Behind his calm exterior, however, his mind was racing through protocols and contingencies. Deputy Reyes launched into his explanation of the stop, his tone carrying an edge of irritation that was hard to miss. He pointed out the license plate issue, mentioned the delay in pulling over, and asked for license and registration. The deputy's body language suggested he was already preparing for conflict, his hand resting near his duty belt in that casual but ready position that officers often adopt when they expect trouble. Petrov handed over his documents. He did not immediately identify himself as a federal agent because doing so would require explanation. An explanation could lead to radio traffic, and radio traffic could be monitored by anyone with a scanner, including the very criminals he was investigating. Instead, he offered his cover identity. Viktor Petrov, security contractor, licensed to carry concealed weapons. The deputy ran the information and returned to the vehicle with more questions. He had noticed something else during his initial approach. Mounted inside the Tahoe's grille were lights that appeared to be red and blue. Emergency lights, the kind of lights that only law enforcement are supposed to display on public roads. This is where the encounter began its descent into chaos. Deputy Reyes asked about the lights, his suspicion now fully activated. Petrov explained calmly that he was in private security and sometimes used the lights for escort work, though he acknowledged it was a gray area legally. The deputy's response was immediate. He wanted Petrov out of the vehicle. He was going to investigate further. What followed was a textbook example of confirmation bias in action. Deputy Reyes had already decided that something was wrong with this picture. The delayed stop, the emergency lights, the security contractor cover story that seemed too convenient. In his mind, he was dealing with either a dangerous impersonator or someone involved in illegal activity. The possibility that this might be a legitimate federal agent on sensitive duty never seriously entered his calculations. Petrov stepped out of the Tahoe slowly, his hands visible, his movements deliberate. He was accustomed to high-tension situations, but this one was different. Usually the danger came from criminals who might recognize him as law enforcement. This danger came from law enforcement who refused to recognize him as one of their own. Deputy Reyes called for backup. Within minutes, 2 more patrol units arrived, their lights painting the desert in alternating red and blue. The other deputies, Rodriguez and Kim, approached with the same energy as Reyes. They had been told over the radio that this might be a law enforcement impersonator, possibly armed, possibly dangerous. Here's the thing about impersonators. They do exist. People buy fake badges online, create fraudulent credentials, and use them for everything from petty scams to serious crimes. Deputies are trained to be suspicious of anyone claiming to be law enforcement, especially if their credentials seem unusual or their story does not quite add up. But that training has a dark side. It can make officers so focused on catching impersonators that they become unable to recognize the real thing. Deputy Reyes asked if there were any weapons in the vehicle. Petrov confirmed there were, because of course there were. He was a federal agent operating undercover. He was carrying multiple firearms, along with tactical equipment, communication devices, and documentation that would prove his identity to anyone who took the time to actually examine it. What do you think happens next? Put yourself in Deputy Reyes's position. You have stopped someone with emergency lights in their vehicle, multiple weapons, and a story about being a security contractor. What would you do? Would you take the time to verify his credentials through federal channels? Would you call a supervisor with experience in multi-agency operations? Or would you assume you have caught a dangerous impersonator and act accordingly? Take a moment to consider your answer. Think about what you would want an officer to do if they stopped you under similar circumstances. Then continue watching to see what actually happened. Deputy Reyes made his decision. He instructed Petrov to turn around and place his hands behind his back. He was being detained while they sorted this out. The handcuffs clicked shut, and Viktor Petrov, a federal agent with security clearances most local deputies cannot even imagine, found himself standing in the Nevada desert, being treated like a common criminal. The deputies then began searching the Tahoe. They found exactly what you would expect to find in a federal agent's undercover vehicle: tactical vests with law enforcement insignia, multiple forms of identification, communication equipment, and documentation that should have immediately raised questions about whether their assumptions were correct. But instead of reconsidering, the deputies doubled down. One of them held up an FBI badge and credential case, examining it with the skepticism of someone who has already decided the answer. Another found a vest that read, "0." A third discovered multiple government ID cards with different agency logos. Think about what this looked like from their perspective. Here was a man with more badges than anyone they had ever encountered, multiple identities, emergency lights, and weapons, to deputies who rarely interact with federal task forces. This abundance of credentials seemed suspicious rather than clarifying. Who has this many badges? An impersonator trying too hard to seem legitimate. That is who. Deputy Reyes made a comment that would later become infamous when the body camera footage was released. Looking at the collection of credentials spread across the hood of the Tahoe, he said something to the effect of, "If something appears to be suspicious, seems suspicious, and keeps looking suspicious, it probably is suspicious." He was applying folk wisdom to a situation that required actual investigation. Meanwhile, Viktor Petrov stood in handcuffs, watching deputies paw through his equipment and mock his credentials. Every minute that passed was a minute his investigation was at risk. Every piece of equipment they handled was potentially contaminated. Every radio transmission about an impersonator stop was potentially being monitored by someone who should not know about his presence in the area. He tried to explain. He gave them numbers to call, supervisors who could verify his identity, protocols that existed specifically for situations like this. But the deputies were not interested. They had already solved this case in their minds. This man was an impersonator, and all these credentials just proved how elaborate his scam was. The irony was almost unbearable. Petrov had spent years putting dangerous people in prison. He had worked cases that involved risks these deputies could not comprehend. He had saved lives, protected children, and served his country in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. And now he was being lectured by a county deputy about the importance of following the law. The detention lasted over 45 minutes. During that time, Petrov remained calm but firm. He repeatedly asked the deputies to make verification calls. He explained the concept of federal task forces. He described how undercover work sometimes requires multiple identities and credentials. Each explanation was met with increased skepticism. Finally, reluctantly, one of the deputies made a call. It took several transfers, but eventually the call reached someone at the FBI field office who could confirm that yes, Viktor Petrov was exactly who he claimed to be. Yes, his investigation was legitimate. Yes, they needed to release him immediately. And yes, there would likely be consequences for how this stop had been handled. The handcuffs came off. There was no apology, at least not a genuine one. Deputy Reyes muttered something about just doing his job, just following protocol, just being careful. Petrov retrieved his credentials without comment. He climbed back into his Tahoe, started the engine, and drove away. His investigation compromised, and his trust in local law enforcement significantly diminished. In the days that followed, the incident made its way up multiple chains of command. The sheriff's office received formal complaints from federal agencies. There were meetings, reviews, and discussions about interdepartmental cooperation. The body camera footage was eventually released through public records requests, and it became a case study in how not to handle encounters with potential federal personnel. What can we learn from this encounter? Several things. First, that confidence is not the same as competence. Deputy Reyes was absolutely certain he had caught an impersonator. His certainty made him immune to evidence that contradicted his conclusion. Second, that our assumptions about what criminals look like can blind us to reality. Petrov did not match the deputy's mental image of a federal agent, so they could not see him as one. Third, that the consequences of these mistakes fall disproportionately on the innocent. Petrov lost weeks of investigation work. The deputies faced internal review but kept their jobs. But the story in Nevada is just the beginning, because while those deputies were learning their lesson the hard way, another encounter was developing in the Florida Panhandle that would take the concept of awkward law enforcement interactions to an entirely different level. This time, the local deputy would not just stop a federal agent. He would stop an agent who was actively investigating him. Picture the Gulf Coast of Florida in late January 2020. The town of Palmetto Bay sits along the coastline of Franklin County, one of those quiet communities where everyone knows everyone, and law enforcement is more about community presence than serious crime fighting. The winter air carried a slight chill that felt refreshing compared to the oppressive humidity of summer. Deputy Raymond Tucker had been with the Franklin County Sheriff's Office for 16 years, long enough to feel like he understood everything about his jurisdiction. What Deputy Tucker did not understand was that for the past several months, his name had been appearing in federal documents. The FBI's Jacksonville field office had opened an investigation into corruption within the Franklin County Sheriff's Office, and Deputy Tucker's activities had attracted particular attention. The details of what he was suspected of remain partially sealed, but the investigation was serious enough to warrant dedicated surveillance and a special agent assigned full-time to the case. That special agent was Nathan Clark. He was 43 years old, a 12-year veteran of the Bureau, and he specialized in public corruption cases. Clark had spent his career building cases against people who abused positions of trust, from city council members taking bribes to police officers running protection rackets. He was methodical, patient, and very good at his job. On this particular January morning, Clark was conducting mobile surveillance of Deputy Tucker. He was driving a Bureau-owned vehicle registered to a front company called Atlantic Communication Services, a common practice for federal agencies that need unmarked vehicles that cannot be easily traced back to law enforcement. His goal was simple: observe Tucker's activities, document any suspicious contacts, and continue building the foundation for what he hoped would eventually be a successful prosecution. Then Deputy Tucker's personal cell phone rang. Clark needed to speak with Tucker directly about a separate matter related to the investigation, and he made the call without thinking through how strange it might seem. Tucker answered, heard a voice he did not recognize, and immediately became suspicious. How did this person get his personal number? Why were they asking questions about things that were none of their business? Deputy Tucker did something that would later prove incredibly ironic. He decided to investigate the suspicious caller. He ran the phone number through law enforcement databases. He noted that the caller had claimed to be from some kind of communications company. And then he spotted a vehicle in his rearview mirror that seemed to be following at a consistent distance. You have to appreciate the situation here. A corrupt deputy was about to confront the federal agent investigating him for corruption. Tucker had no idea who Clark really was. And Clark had no idea that his phone call had triggered Tucker's suspicion. Two men, each thinking they were hunting the other, about to come face to face on a quiet Florida road. Deputy Tucker pulled his patrol car to the side of the road and waited. Sure enough, the dark blue sedan following him slowed down. Tucker executed a quick U-turn and fell in behind the sedan, running its plates as he approached. The registration came back to Atlantic Communication Services, a company Tucker had never heard of, which only increased his suspicion. He activated his lights. Inside the sedan, Special Agent Clark faced a decision that had no good options. He was being pulled over by the subject of his own investigation. If he identified himself as FBI, Tucker would know he was being investigated, potentially compromising months of work. If he did not identify himself, the situation could escalate in unpredictable ways. Clark pulled to the shoulder and watched through his mirrors as Tucker approached. The deputy was tall, heavy-set, with the kind of swagger that came from years of unchallenged authority in a small jurisdiction. His hand rested on his weapon as he walked, not drawing, but ready. At the window, Tucker demanded identification. Clark provided his driver's license, which was in his real name, but with an address that would trace to Bureau cover facilities. Tucker examined it with the intensity of someone who already suspected something was wrong. Then Clark made his decision. He identified himself as a federal agent and asked Tucker to step back so he could retrieve his credentials. He also, crucially, asked Tucker if he would mind deactivating his body camera for a moment. He framed it as a courtesy, a professional conversation between law enforcement officers that did not need to be recorded. Put yourself in Tucker's position. A stranger who claims to be FBI is asking you to turn off your body camera. Your training tells you never to do that, but your curiosity and perhaps something else is telling you that something bigger is happening here. Tucker did not turn off his camera immediately, but his suspicion escalated dramatically. He called for backup. Within minutes, another deputy arrived, and the two of them had Clark step out of the vehicle while they decided what to do. What they decided was extraordinary. Despite Clark showing FBI credentials, despite his professional demeanor, despite everything about this situation screaming that they should verify through proper channels, the deputies chose to detain him. They placed him in the back of Tucker's patrol car while they figured things out. The back of a patrol car in coastal Florida in January is not as dangerous as it would be in summer, but it is still an enclosed space with limited ventilation and temperatures that can become uncomfortable quickly. Clark was dressed in layers appropriate for surveillance work, which meant he was too warm for the confined space. The windows were up, the air conditioning was off, and nobody seemed in any hurry to resolve the situation. Minutes passed. Clark remained professional at first, answering questions through the partition, requesting that they make verification calls, explaining the protocols that existed for exactly these situations. The deputies were not interested in protocols. They were interested in figuring out how a stranger had gotten Tucker's personal phone number and why this supposed federal agent was driving around their county in a suspicious vehicle. The temperature in the car continued to rise. Clark's layers of clothing trapped body heat. He began to feel the first signs of heat exhaustion, dizziness, shortness of breath, a sense that something was very wrong with his body. He called out to the deputies. He told them he was having trouble breathing. He said he needed medical attention. He asked them to open a window, turn on the air, do something to help him. The deputies did not respond immediately. They were still focused on their investigation, still trying to figure out what was really going on. Clark was a suspected impersonator, possibly a stalker, maybe someone planning to do Deputy Tucker harm. His complaints about the heat were probably exaggerated, a tactic to get released before they could figure out the truth. This happens more often than most people realize. Officers become so focused on their narrative, so convinced they know what is happening, that they dismiss genuine medical emergencies as manipulation tactics. It is a form of tunnel vision that has led to deaths in custody, lawsuits, and destroyed careers. Yet it keeps happening because the training emphasizes maintaining control above almost everything else. Clark's condition deteriorated rapidly. His breathing became labored. He reported that his vision was blurring. He began to experience the kind of panic that comes when your body tells you something is seriously wrong. His voice, previously controlled and professional, became desperate. He shouted for emergency medical services. He screamed that he needed help. He begged them to call an ambulance. If you are watching this and you have ever been in a situation where someone with authority over you refused to believe you were in distress, you understand a fraction of what Clark was experiencing. The helplessness of being trapped, ignored, and dismissed while your body fails is a particular kind of horror that stays with people forever. Finally, one of the deputies seemed to realize that Clark's distress was genuine. They opened the car door and allowed him to step out into the cooler, outside air. He was sweating profusely, his face flushed, his breathing rapid and shallow. It was obvious now that he had been telling the truth about his physical condition. An ambulance was called. Clark was evaluated at the scene and eventually cleared to leave without hospital transport, though his recovery took hours. By that time, verifications had been made, supervisors had been called, and the reality of the situation had become painfully clear to everyone involved. Deputy Raymond Tucker had detained the FBI agent investigating him for corruption. He had placed that agent in a situation that could have resulted in serious medical harm or death. He had done all of this on camera, creating evidence that would be useful not just for the corruption investigation, but potentially for civil rights violations as well. The aftermath was swift and severe. The FBI's investigation into Tucker and the sheriff's office accelerated. Additional federal attention focused on how the department handled encounters with out-of-jurisdiction law enforcement. Tucker's superiors faced questions about training, protocols, and supervision. The body camera footage made its way into federal court filings, where it painted a picture of a department that prioritized protecting its own over following proper procedures. As for Special Agent Clark, he recovered physically, but was removed from the Tucker investigation due to the compromised circumstances. His months of careful work would be continued by others, but the personal satisfaction of seeing the case through was denied him. He had been victimized by the very person he was trying to bring to justice. There is a profound lesson in this encounter about the dangers of power exercised without oversight. Deputy Tucker operated for years in a small jurisdiction where his authority was rarely questioned. When he encountered someone who did not fit his expectations, his instinct was to assert dominance rather than seek understanding. That instinct, left unchecked by proper training and supervision, led him to detain a federal agent and nearly cause a medical emergency. How many other people had Tucker treated this way? How many citizens without federal credentials had been detained, dismissed, or mistreated because they did not fit his expectations? The body camera captured one incident, but patterns of behavior do not emerge from single events. We will never know the full story of Deputy Tucker's career. What we know is that his encounter with Agent Clark became part of a larger federal case, and that case had consequences for more than just one deputy. But the most dramatic encounter was still to come. Because while the Nevada and Florida incidents involved verbal confrontations and temporary detentions, the third story involves violence. It involves multiple officers, drawn weapons, and a federal agent who refused to submit to treatment he knew was wrong. It involves tasers, a federal lawsuit, and questions about whether there is any level of compliance that can protect someone once officers have decided to use force. The date was August 12, 2020. The location was a residential neighborhood in Riverside County, California, a sprawling suburban area east of Los Angeles, where tract homes sit on streets with names like Sycamore Lane and Desert Wind Drive. Special Agent Marcus Washington of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Tobacco, firearms, and explosives had come to this quiet neighborhood on official business that had nothing to do with the people who would soon put him on the ground. Washington was 41 years old, a 13-year veteran of the ATF with a specialty in firearms trafficking cases. On this particular summer afternoon, he was attempting to retrieve an unregistered shotgun from a residence on Mesquite Court. The weapon had come up in an ongoing investigation, and Washington had coordinated with the registered homeowner to collect it voluntarily. It should have been a simple pickup. Arrive, identify himself, collect the weapon, provide documentation, and leave. What Washington did not know was that the homeowner's wife was not comfortable with the arrangement. She did not recognize Washington from previous interactions. She was not fully informed about why her husband had agreed to surrender a weapon, and when a stranger appeared at her door asking about a shotgun, she did not believe his explanation. She called the police. She told them that someone claiming to be a federal agent was at her door, that he was asking about weapons, and that she was afraid. The call went out as a possible law enforcement impersonator, armed, potentially dangerous. Multiple units responded. Washington was still standing on the porch, waiting for the homeowner to return with the shotgun, when the first patrol car screamed around the corner onto Mesquite Court. Before he could process what was happening, another car appeared from the opposite direction. Officers emerged with weapons drawn, shouting commands. Think about this moment from Washington's perspective. He was a federal agent on official duty, conducting a routine evidence collection. He had credentials, authorization, and every legal right to be exactly where he was standing. And suddenly, without warning, local officers were pointing guns at him and treating him like a criminal. His training kicked in immediately. He raised his hands. He announced clearly that he was a federal law enforcement officer. He gave his badge number. He offered to show his credentials. The officers were not interested in credentials. They were interested in compliance. Their training told them that impersonators often carry fake badges, that anyone can claim to be federal law enforcement, and that the safest approach was to assume the worst until proven otherwise. They kept their weapons trained on Washington and shouted for him to get on the ground. This is where the situation became a standoff. Washington knew that getting on the ground meant losing control of the encounter. It meant being handcuffed, searched, and detained before anyone bothered to verify his identity. It meant being treated like a criminal for doing his job. Everything in his professional experience told him that once he was on the ground, the officers would have no incentive to listen to his explanations. But the officers saw his refusal differently. To them, a person refusing to comply with armed officers was automatically suspicious. An innocent person would get on the ground. An innocent person would let them sort things out. Only someone with something to hide would argue with officers who had guns pointed at them. Washington kept his hands raised. He spoke clearly and calmly. He identified himself repeatedly as federal law enforcement. He offered to slowly retrieve his credentials and show them. He explained that he was on official ATF business, that the homeowner could confirm his presence was expected, that all of this was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up in seconds if they would just verify his identity. The officers advanced. They continued shouting commands. They were operating on adrenaline now, in that heightened state where training takes over and nuance disappears. This man was not complying. That made him a threat. Threats had to be neutralized. Let me ask you something before we continue. What would you have done in Washington's position? Would you have gotten on the ground, submitted to detention, and trusted that the system would eventually sort things out? Or would you have insisted on being treated with the dignity your badge entitled you to, knowing that compliance might validate their aggressive approach? There is no right answer to this question. Both choices carry risks. But the question itself reveals something important about how power works in America. Even federal agents with legitimate credentials face moments where they must choose between dignity and safety. For ordinary citizens without badges, that choice is even starker. Washington chose dignity. He chose to stand his ground, literally, and insist that he be verified before being treated like a criminal. The officers chose force. One of them moved in quickly, attempting to take Washington to the ground using a takedown technique. Washington instinctively braced against the movement, not fighting, but not facilitating either. The officer interpreted this as resistance. He called out to his partners that the subject was resisting. Within seconds, Washington was surrounded. Multiple officers attempted to control him simultaneously. In the chaos of bodies and commands and adrenaline, someone deployed a taser. The electrical discharge hit Washington in the back. His muscles seized. He experienced the overwhelming pain that taser deployment causes, a pain that has been described as being set on fire from the inside while every muscle in your body contracts at once. He went down, but he was not done. Between taser cycles, he continued identifying himself. He shouted his badge number. He demanded they verify his identity. He insisted he was a federal agent being assaulted by local police. The officers tasered him again. After the second deployment, Washington stopped resisting. He could not resist, even if he had wanted to. His body had been overloaded with electrical current. His muscles were spasming, and his mind was struggling to process what was happening. They handcuffed him on the ground. They searched him. They found his ATF credentials exactly where he had told them they would be. They found his service weapon, properly holstered and clearly government-issued. They found everything that proved he was exactly who he had claimed to be from the very first moment. And then, only then, did they begin to realize what they had done. Washington lay on the ground, breathing hard, his body still twitching from the taser after effects. He reported that he had a heart condition. He said he was having trouble breathing. He described symptoms that could indicate cardiac distress. The officers called for medical assistance. They helped him into a sitting position. They brought water. They did all the things they should have done 20 minutes earlier, before the guns and the tasers and the physical violence. Paramedics arrived and evaluated Washington at the scene. His vital signs were elevated but stabilizing. He declined hospital transport, probably because he was determined not to give these officers the satisfaction of seeing him taken away in an ambulance. He sat on the curb, drank water, and waited for his body to recover from what had been done to it. The homeowner eventually emerged and confirmed everything Washington had said. Yes, he had arranged for the ATF to collect a weapon. Yes, Agent Washington had contacted him in advance. Yes, this entire situation was an absurd misunderstanding that never should have happened. Washington was released without charges, obviously since he had committed no crime. He retrieved his credentials and his weapon. He collected the shotgun that had brought him to this neighborhood in the first place. And then he went home to begin documenting everything that had happened. What he documented became the foundation of a federal civil rights lawsuit. Washington sued the officers involved, their department, and the county, alleging excessive force, false arrest, and violation of his constitutional rights. The lawsuit detailed every moment of the encounter, from the initial approach to the taser deployments to the medical distress that followed. The legal process that followed took over 2 years. There were depositions, discovery, motions, and negotiations. The officers defended their actions by citing their training, the reported possibility of an impersonator, and Washington's refusal to comply with commands. They argued they had no way of knowing he was really a federal agent until they had secured the scene. But body camera footage told a different story. It showed officers who were not interested in verification, who escalated force before attempting communication, who tasered a man who had never made any threatening movements. It showed a federal agent being treated like a dangerous criminal for the offense of standing on a porch and doing his job. The case eventually settled. The terms were confidential, but settlements in excessive force cases often run into 6 figures, sometimes higher when the victim is a fellow law enforcement officer. The officers involved faced internal review, but remained employed. The department implemented new training protocols for encounters with potential federal personnel. For Special Agent Washington, the settlement money could never compensate for what had been done to him. He had been assaulted by people who were supposed to be his colleagues in the larger mission of public safety. He had been treated as a criminal by officers who could not see past their own assumptions. He had been tasered twice for the crime of insisting on his dignity. Months after the settlement, in a private conversation that was later shared publicly, Washington said something that encapsulates the entire problem. He said that when he saw those officers approaching with drawn weapons, his first thought was not fear for his safety. His first thought was disappointment. Disappointment that colleagues in law enforcement would be so quick to assume the worst, so unwilling to take 30 seconds to verify before resorting to force. That disappointment speaks to a deeper truth about American policing. The emphasis on command and control, on immediate compliance, on treating every encounter as a potential threat creates officers who cannot recognize legitimate authority when they see it. If even a federal agent with proper credentials cannot avoid being tasered, what hope does an ordinary citizen have? These three stories, the undercover agent in Nevada, the corruption investigator in Florida, and the ATF agent in California, represent three variations on the same theme. In each case, local officers were so certain of their own authority, so confident in their assumptions that they could not recognize federal agents operating legitimately within their jurisdictions. But these are not just stories about mistaken identity. They are stories about the culture of policing in America, about what happens when officers are trained to demand compliance rather than seek understanding. They are stories about the gap between the image of law enforcement as protectors of the community and the reality of officers who cannot admit when they might be wrong. The federal agents in these stories had resources that ordinary citizens do not have. They had credentials that could eventually be verified. They had the backing of powerful agencies that would advocate on their behalf. They had the knowledge and training to survive encounters that went badly. And even with all of those advantages, they were humiliated, detained, and in one case, physically assaulted. Imagine being pulled over without those protections. Imagine being detained by officers who have already decided you are guilty, without a federal agency to call on your behalf, without colleagues who will demand accountability, without body camera footage that might eventually vindicate you. This is the reality for millions of Americans who encounter police every day. What should have happened in each of these cases? The answer is not complicated. Officers should have verified credentials through proper channels before escalating. They should have contacted supervisors with experience in multi-agency operations. They should have taken the time to consider that their initial assumptions might be wrong. They should have treated unknown individuals with the respect that all people deserve, regardless of whether they turn out to be federal agents or ordinary citizens. Instead, in each case, officers chose confrontation over communication. They chose force over verification. They chose their own authority over the possibility that someone else might have legitimate power too. The aftermath of these encounters has led to some changes. Departments across the country have updated their training protocols for interactions with potential federal personnel. Some agencies have created hotlines specifically for verifying federal credentials in the field. Others have implemented policies requiring supervisor approval before detaining anyone claiming to be a federal agent. But training and policies only work if officers actually follow them. The deeper problem is cultural, a mindset that prioritizes control over communication, that treats every encounter as a potential threat, that can't tolerate uncertainty or ambiguity. Until that mindset changes, encounters like these will continue to happen. As you have watched these stories unfold, you have probably formed opinions about who was right and who was wrong in each encounter. You have probably thought about what you would have done in the shoes of the officers, the agents, or the bystanders who watched it all happen. Those thoughts and opinions matter because public awareness is one of the most powerful forces for change in policing. If you have made it this far, you understand that these are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a larger problem that affects everyone who drives on public roads, walks through neighborhoods, or interacts with law enforcement in any capacity. The badge that is supposed to protect and serve can become a weapon when it is wielded by someone who cannot see past their own assumptions. So what happens now? For the agents in these stories, life goes on. They return to their investigations, their cases, their ongoing mission to protect the public. They carry the scars of these encounters, visible and invisible, and they incorporate the lessons into their own approach to law enforcement. For the officers involved, there are varying degrees of consequence. Some faced internal discipline. Some became subjects of federal investigations themselves. Some simply went back to work, their careers barely affected by encounters that could have ended in tragedy. And for us, the observers of these stories, there is the choice of what to do with what we have learned. We can share these stories so that others understand the reality of policing in America. We can advocate for reforms that prioritize de-escalation and verification over immediate force. We can demand accountability when officers make catastrophic mistakes, regardless of whether the victim turns out to be a federal agent or an ordinary citizen. The badge is supposed to represent authority exercised in service of the community. When that authority is used to detain, demean, and assault the wrong people, it undermines the legitimacy of everyone who wears one. Federal agents and local officers are supposed to be on the same side, working toward the same goals of public safety and justice. Encounters like these reveal how far reality can stray from that ideal. There is one more lesson embedded in these stories, and it is perhaps the most important one. Each of the federal agents in these encounters had options that ordinary citizens do not have. They could identify themselves as law enforcement. They could cite badge numbers and agency affiliations. They could invoke protocols designed to verify their credentials. And yet, in each case, these options failed. The Nevada agent showed multiple credentials and was dismissed as an elaborate impersonator. The Florida agent identified himself immediately and was detained anyway. The California agent repeatedly announced his status and was tasered for his trouble. If even federal agents cannot talk their way out of aggressive encounters with local police, what does that tell us about the options available to everyone else? What does it tell us about the advice to remain calm, follow commands, and trust the system to sort things out? The answer is uncomfortable but important. The system does not always sort things out. Following commands does not guarantee safety. Remaining calm does not prevent officers from escalating force. The only thing that consistently makes a difference is the presence of witnesses, recordings, and the eventual possibility of accountability. These 3 federal agents got their accountability because they had the resources and standing to pursue it. They had agencies that backed them, lawyers who represented them, and body camera footage that documented what happened. Most people who encounter aggressive policing have none of those things. So when you hear these stories, do not just think about the irony of cops arresting feds. Think about the systemic issues that made these encounters possible. Think about the training that teaches officers to demand compliance rather than seek understanding. Think about the culture that treats every unknown person as a potential threat. Think about the gap between how law enforcement is supposed to work and how it actually works in practice. And then think about what we can do collectively to close that gap. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. These encounters deserve to be told in full, not as brief news items, but as complete narratives that reveal the complexity of power, authority, and human fallibility. If you found value in this detailed exploration, consider sharing it with others who care about these issues. And if you want to see more investigations like this one, more stories that go beyond the headlines to examine the reality beneath, you know what to do. Until next time, stay informed, stay aware, and remember that justice requires all of us to pay attention.